Welcome, everyone. This is going to be a little part two of integrating John Vervaeke's work. John Vervaeke has an incredible depth of work, and I feel that it would take hundreds of hours to fully deconstruct and understand and integrate all of his work. But that is what we will be attempting to do today. Um, my sole intention today is to pluck out one or two foundational concepts of awakening from the meaning crisis and to really unpack them. And so I'm going to start by reading a little article that I wrote on the meaning crisis, and then I'm going to go into those two concepts of awakening from the meaning crisis so that we can deconstruct them. All right, so the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke has set forth, is descriptive of the times that we're living in. We could broadly think of the meaning crisis as the endemic struggle to find meaning and purpose in modern life. It's becoming apparent that it's really difficult to find meaning and purpose, and the way that the modern world is set up leads us down many traps and side roads that leave us alienated, isolated, lonely, depressed, anxious, and full of mental challenges. That being said, in an attempt to uncover what the meaning crisis is, I believe that we can make progress on understanding why the world is set up this way, perhaps what we can do about it going forward from here. So there's this inextricable link between capitalism and the meaning crisis. Part of the meaning crisis, in my mind, relates to relates to how capitalism has everyone like promoting their own businesses. Everyone's starting businesses. Everyone's promoting their own businesses. This market mechanism is very valuable in many regards, but also there's a larger and larger and a larger subset of culture that has become captured by capitalist incentives. Human connection is being captured by capitalist incentives. It's very difficult to know when someone truly has your best interests in mind anymore, when they just want to sell you something. I was listening to a podcast recently from Daniel Schmachtenberger and Z-Dog, and they talked about how so much of the epistemic commons is just trashed by people's desire to make other people believe stuff. A quote that I found very interesting is that if you don't is that quote, if you don't know who the sucker in the room is, then it's you. End quote. The world is largely functioning on the assumption that self-interest is the only thing in the world that exists. But there's also the perspective that tells us that there's a genuine care and higher order principles that transcend selfishness and power games that we can engage with. And so this is when we get into these multipolar traps. Some subset of the population wants to orient their life towards genuine care, higher order principles, and they want to overcome power games. You could call this like game B. Game B has been a term to describe this for a while. But then you get these multipolar traps of when someone is playing the game, they can easily take advantage of someone that's trying to escape the game and play by different rules. Furthermore, social media tends to deteriorate meaning. One of the trends that we're seeing in the social media landscape recently that feels relevant to talk about here is the fact that all of the major social media platforms are devolving into 15-second video content. You see TikToks, Reels, YouTube Shorts, etc., which I myself am engaging with on a daily basis as well. I am falling into this trap, so I am talking from experience of how addictive and destructive these reels and TikToks and shorts can be, which I believe that it's destructive because it is making it more and more difficult to find meaning in the world. I believe that meaning is not something that can be captured in 15 seconds. It takes years of study and commitment to something that you believe in to really generate this meaning. And this is the exact opposite of how you will spend your attention when you use TikTok for an hour a day or any other app. Plus, social media tends to amplify the most negative and destructive voices that are the most antithetical to finding meaning in life. Furthermore, our society seems to have been captured by mass nihilism and cynicism. More and more people are seeing that nihilism is the only viable meaning construct, belief system, way of orienting life, and that meaninglessness is just the way that the world works, and there's nothing worth living for. This has become a very, very common way of orienting oneself towards life. And on the other side of the spectrum, we're seeing hippie new agers living in these kind of fairy tale lands, pretending there's infinite meaning without really having any grounding. They're trying to orient towards meaning in new ways, and I completely support this effort to find meaning in new ways. But it seems that there's not much grounding to a lot of these hippie new age approaches, and that they would benefit from grounding um, their search for meaning a little bit, not being so um, quick to believe spiritual belief systems. So I propose that both sides are leading us astray. Well, there are many other sides, but these are the ones that I'm noting for now. And the problem that we're aiming to get clear on here is what now? What do we do about this massive amount of nihilism and this feeling that the world is stupid and worthless and there's no reason to do anything? What do we do about this? That's what I'll be talking about today with John Vervaeke's primary concepts. So there's a few concepts that John Vervaeke has laid forth. Relevance realization. So I'm going to actually just outline them here. So boom, 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 boom. All right, so he has relevance realization, and there's parasitic processing, and then there's abe, um, and there's um, dynamical systems theory, and there's the four modes of knowing. So, so there's propositional knowing, participatory knowing. There is procedural knowing, propositional, participatory, procedural, and perspective. So we'll be going into these in this segment. Furthermore, there's continuous cosmos. Continuous cosmos in the modern world grammar, and we really touched on that in the last live stream, so we won't be touching on that today. So today I would like to go into a few ideas on parasitic processing / reciprocal narrowing, relevance realization, and the four modes of knowing. So what are the four modes of knowing? What are the four modes of knowing? First of all, there's propositional knowing. Propositional knowing is knowing propositions. This is a lot of the domain of education, modern education in school. So with propositional knowing, we see, memorizing lines of text as a lot of memorizing. Memorizing is the name of the game in propositional knowing, but it's really about like how much cognitive content can you hold in your awareness and grab from in any moment, and how many facts and propositions. And this is very in the realm of belief systems as well, in ideologies. Like, what are you believing? What are the propositions and rules of your belief system? A procedural knowing, the best way that I've heard this described is through like learning how to ride a bike. Procedural knowing is learning how to do something, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to cook, learning how to juggle, learning how to do a handstand, learning how to do any number of procedural things. So it's like going through procedures, learning how to, drive a car, operate machinery. This is all procedural knowing. And you can see the way that it gets compared is that you can memorize as much you can memorize millions of facts about how bikes work and how to ride a bike and how cars work, but you that won't ever get you any closer to actually learning how to ride the bike itself or drive the car because that is a procedure. Perspectival knowing. So perspectival knowing. So what is your perspectives? What are your paradigms? What are the fundamental assumptions of your worldview? What are the fundamental tenets that your beliefs are resting on? What are the perspectives that you are holding onto the most tightly? That being said, I believe that perspectival knowing goes much deeper, and I am currently looking at my notes on perspectival knowing, and we with the attempt to get deeper on the subject. All right, so as John Vervaeke lays it out, their perspectival knowing is a way of putting yourself in different perspectives. Like think of it this way: you can memorize tons of propositions and facts without ever truly putting yourself in the perspective of that worldview. Therefore, perspectival knowing is not the same thing as propositional knowing. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper here. Okay. Another way of understanding perspectival knowing, and this may also relate to participatory knowing, but I believe that Vervaeke talked about this in one of his episodes relating to perspectival knowing. So he talked about this in relationship to being in a therapist office. One of the things that you can do with a therapist is that you can almost role play. You can try on different identities, and it's this space where you can experiment with different identities, different perspectives. You can literally like become different perspectives and try them out in this safe environment, and that could be described as perspectival knowing. Furthermore, then last but not least, participatory knowing. Participatory is being in an act of participation and in being transformed because of your participation in that act. So we can see participatory knowing as all right, so participatory knowing. John Vervaeke describes it as modal memory. This is modal memory. He says, remembering a lost mode of being, remembering what it's like to exist in the being mode. So, this is remembering other modes of being. What is it like to exist in a different way? This is what participatory knowing is. So, furthermore, we, in the last live stream, we talked about the continuous cosmos. And there was an idea in here, and there was an idea in here. Actually, I think it was in the flow episode that relates to participatory knowing. And we are going to unpack that today. So what we talked about in the last is that there's in flow, there's this optimal grip. That's what it was. So there's a fundamental relationship between participatory knowing and having an optimal grip on the world. In order to upon experiencing a different mode of being, our optimal grip on the world changes. We come into a different relationship, to a different relationship with the world itself. Our connection to the world is in this constant process of feedback and response. And the more tightly coupled at this feedback and response loop is the what we could say better the optimal grip is with reality. And when we see someone that when we call someone and we say, oh, that person is out of touch with reality, we're saying that they don't really have an optimal grip on the way that things are happening. If you're in a social group with a dozen of other people, you can say that someone might be extremely obnoxious and they're not getting this optimal grip on what the relationship is between how much to share, how much to receive. They might be all share, no receive. And this is not an optimal grip on reality or on a collective. And so, that being said, this is how we're understanding participatory knowing. Participatory knowing can be described as, being part of a group. There's a very distinct feeling that comes with being a part of a group. It comes with interacting as a collective, that comes with dialogos. So one of John Vervaeke's key terms is dialogos, and dialogos is like this. It's not a friendship. It's not an intimate relationship. It's not a merely intellectual conversation. It is a dialogue between people where the sum total of that dialogue is greater than the sum of its parts. People are able to pick out the noise and the signal and other people's share and grab what is valuable from someone else's share and add onto it in this sort of amalgamation, this collective. And so that is the 4 modes of knowing. Now we're going to go on to this process onto reciprocal narrowing / reciprocal opening / parasitic processing. So parasitic processing, reciprocal narrowing are 2 ways of describing suffering. So, as Vervaeke talked about in his series, I am pulling up the notes right here. As Vervaeke talked about in his series, parasitic processing is when parasitic processing is when it's a downward spiral. It's when we get in this negative feedback loop where everything we do decreases the arena that we are engaging with. Okay, so I'm going to go through John Vervaeke's notes on parasitic processing to help us unpack this term a little bit. They say Stephen Batchelor argues that we don't interpret Buddhism very well because of our Western paradigm. Batchelor's core claims about Buddhism that Vervaeke lays out in episode 13 of Awakening from the Meeting Crisis is this: Claim number one, you can only interpret Buddhism from within the tradition of Buddhism. The ways that we have of understanding Buddhism from a Western perspective are completely inadequate for fully understanding the interpretive framework that is used within Buddhism is not the same as the one that is used in the West. Buddhism is about transformation in the perspectival mode of knowing, altering the agent arena relationship. Altering the agent arena relationship. You can only acquire wisdom through practice, not just mere propositional knowing. And so, if one tries to take our Western way of understanding things in a propositional way and bringing it into the Buddhist tradition, this is going to be inadequate because Buddhism can only be acquired through practice, through procedural knowing, through perspectival knowing. And so, we could say that, all right, so then the second claim is that there is an outside study of Buddhism, the academic study of Buddhism, trying to be objective about Buddhism, but not engaging in the practice. So therefore, there are two ways of understanding Buddhism. One is the academic context, which the West seems to spend a lot of time on. And the number one is the procedural way of understanding Buddhism that tries to understand Buddhism within its own interpretive framework. This requires perspectival knowing. This requires the acquisition of wisdom, which we will talk about later. Batchelor says that Buddhism is about both of these claims. Buddhism, we include both of these ways of understanding Buddhism, but transcend them both. According to Batchelor, our work is to come up with ways of making meaning in a cultural, historical context that is not conducive, even deleterious, to doing so. Let me repeat that again. Our work is to come up with ways of making meaning in a cultural, historical context that is not conducive, even detrimental to doing so. Let me read that again. Go quote this. Our work to come up. Our work is to come up with ways of making meaning in a cultural, historical context that is not conducive, even detrimental to doing so. So what are these ways of making meaning that are frowned upon in our culture? What are these ways of making meaning that are frowned upon in our culture? What are these ways of making meaning that seem like outside of the cultural web, outside of the cultural landscape? What are the ways of making meaning that lie outside of our cultural frameworks, cultural normalities? That is what I would like to discuss today. The core proposition is that you can't understand Buddhism as a set of beliefs. It requires propositional, participatory knowing. Furthermore, when we look at ideologies, we can see that ideologies are attempts to create meaning but fail because our primary meaning-making machinery isn't taking place at the level of belief. So ideologies are just a way of making meaning that only include propositional ways of knowing. I'll say that again. So ideologies are very valid attempts to create meaning, but they fail because our meaning-making machinery isn't taking place at the level of belief, aka propositional knowing. Our meaning-making machinery is taking place on the level of perspectival, procedural, and participatory knowing, as we discussed earlier in this live stream. And so therefore, as Vervaeke talks about, reciprocal narrowing is this loss of agency that we can engage in. He calls it parasitic processing or reciprocal narrowing, or we can think of it as a downward spiral where the our ability to interact with the world decreases over time, and that feedback loop causes us to go deeper and deeper and deeper, to lose agency more and more. And so, therefore, I'm going to go into the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism as laid out by Vervaeke in an attempt to understand what perspectival and propositional or participatory knowing are. So, um, the first noble truth, according to Vervaeke, is that all of life is threatened by suffering. Whereas in Buddhism, you see that all of life is suffering. Whereas Vervaeke changes that to all of life is threatened by suffering. And he defines suffering as losing agency. It's pain, but more aptly, it's entrapment. It's this feeling of becoming entrapped, of going on this downward spiral and becoming entrapped by your own self limitations, own self destructive capacities. So his example of this is that when we have anxiety, we fear more. And when we have more fear, then we have more paranoia, which gives us more anxiety, which gives us more fear, which we presume that there's higher likelihood of bad things happening. We get caught on this downward spiral of fear, anxiety, and paranoia. But what I think is really interesting here is that suffering isn't described merely as pain, but as entrapment. Suffering isn't described merely as pain, but as entrapment, as reciprocal, narrowing, and a negative reinforcing feedback loop of self-destruction. And the second claim is that realize that all of your life is existentially threatened with a loss of agency or freedom. Realize that all of your life is existentially threatened with a loss of agency in its in your self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. This is a key point that Vervaeke makes over and over and over again. The very adaptive machinery that we have as human beings makes us vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Parasitic processing is what happens, is the thing that we can put a label on for getting caught in negative reinforcing feedback loops that push us into mental health crises. Parasitic processing is something that's happening on a mass cultural level that's pushing us into negative reinforcing feedback loops that are pushing us into mental health crises. That being said, I'm going to repeat this. The very adaptive machinery that we have as human beings that makes us that adaptive as in survival, the very things biologically that help us survive are the very things that make us vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behaviors. Now, this is really interesting. In every moment of our life, we are susceptible to self-destructive behavior. This is suffering. Suffering is this in every moment knowing that we could be threatened by self-destructive behaviors. And this is what it means that all of life is threatened by dukkha. Life is suffering. All of life is threatened by self-destructive behaviors. And every time you're exercising your agency, you're also making yourself vulnerable to negative reinforcing feedback loops. This is because this negative reinforcing feedback loop is a complex adaptive self-organizing machinery that when you're trying to intervene into one part of the system, you can adapt and it meaning the mental health situation will adapt and reorganize itself to continue to maintain the negative feedback loop, which I find fascinating. That being said, I am going to present my screen. Okay. So I am going to be showing you what I'm looking at here. And this is my attempt at integrating Vervaeke's knowledge into a knowledge graph. All right, so there's a couple key concepts here. Is that complex, adaptive, self-organizing machinery that if you're exercising your agency, you're making yourself vulnerable to negative reinforcing feedback loops, which is aka dukkha. The more mental health illnesses, I want to get clear on this. So mental health conditions, mental health challenges are so difficult to overcome because their very nature is complex, adaptive, self-organizing machinery. All right, so did you get that? It's so hard to overcome because it's a negative, adaptive, self-organizing machinery. And furthermore, when you try to intervene in one part of the system, it will adapt and reorganize itself to maintain. So the system can adapt and reorganize itself. That part is key. So the system will adapt and reorganize itself to maintain a negative feedback loop. And so therefore, what Vervaeke talks about here is that Buddhism as a whole is a positive, complex, adaptive, self-organizing machinery that counteracts the negative reciprocal narrowing of dukkha that threatens every moment of our life with suffering. You get that? All right, and this is very interesting too. Addiction is primarily the loss of agency. So there's a lot here, and so I want to really make this a little bit more concise. So mental health. So there's like this broader umbrella of like mental health, the endemic mental health crisis. Let's just call it that. In our world, there is this mental health crisis. It is caused because so many people are caught in parasitic processing or downward spirals of loss of agency. So many people are caught in this in these downward spirals of loss of agency. So I'm actually going to make it a little easier to read here. And furthermore, once you're on the spiral, increasingly hard to escape the spiral because, and then this is where the complex adaptive machinery part comes in, because very nature is that the mental health challenge reorganizes itself and the system adapts and reorganizes itself to continue to maintain its negative cycle. And that being said, we can also say that our life is existentially threatened with a loss of freedom / agency, because in any moment something trigger us back into our downward spiral. We don't know what that thing is. It's totally random. That threat of going on another downward spiral is the experience of suffering. And we could say, aka addiction, also agency, addiction, and this is addiction, this loss of agency is the addiction. Addiction is not a chemical dependency, but rather the process of reciprocal narrowing. And so there's another concept here. And so what do we do about this? So then the question is, what do we do? Answer is, well, according to Vervaeke, Buddhism is one of the solutions. Say that Buddhism is one of the solutions because it's a counteractive complex machinery that works against the process of reciprocal knowing. So addiction is a perspectively / participatory learning of a loss of agency. Addiction is the felt sense that your world is shrinking, your capacities are shrinking, and you can't interact with the broader world like you used to. So dukkha is threatening a reciprocal narrowing in every moment that we use our agency. So dukkha, aka suffering, the threatening of loss of agency. The Buddha offered a counteractive dynamical system that counteracts parasitic processing and provides reciprocal opening. And this is what the Eightfold Path is. Eightfold Path. This is where I am interested in doing some brainstorming. What are the other counteractive adaptive machineries? What are the other psychotechnologies that counteract these downward spiraling mental health conditions / addictions? This is where the ecology of practices comes in. Given that addiction is such a complex and such an adaptive thing, such mental health, what are the groups of practices that, when combined together, have enough power to catapult one out of their downward spiral and reach escape velocity towards genuine flourishing and sovereignty. So I'm going to suffering. So we could say that suffering equals entrapment. Or even just the threat of entrapment. And then we could say that the four modes of knowing, our a toolkit for finding a toolkit. They are a shared language for identifying and implementing new ways of making that counteract the meaning crisis. So we can say that. So overall, what we learned is that the four modes of knowing are ways is a shared language that we can use to make meaning, and furthermore that this shared way of making meaning can help us out in life. Thank you for listening.